Coming very shortly here with our keynote speech from Dr. Stefan Szymanski. Dr. Stefan Szymanski is the co-author of the New York Times bestselling book, Soccernomics, and he recently co-authored a new book, The City of Champions, about the sports teams in the city of Detroit. He's also a professor of sports management at the University of Michigan and is an advisor to our club. Dr. Szymanski, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me along. Okay, so thank you to Jake and Abby for inviting me to this event. I was listening all this morning and found it very enjoyable. I think this is a great initiative, and I hope this is going to continue to be a great success. So I'm also very grateful for inviting me to talk and be your keynote speaker. And what I want to talk about is finance and really comparing finance in soccer and both before and after COVID, and thinking about what that means, obviously with a particular focus on the future of soccer in the United States. So I want to start out by making this comparison based on the Forbes valuation of professional soccer teams, which from last year, from 2019. And I should probably say at the start, I'll focus primarily on the comparison with Europe, which is meant to be no offense to the South American teams. There's just a lot more and leagues. There's just a lot more data on the finances of European soccer, and in all honesty, the value of European soccer is much greater in aggregate than in South America. Even not that it is insignificant there, though. So the point I want to make with this chart, this table, is to show how surprisingly different the valuations of teams in the United States as to the teams in Europe. So Forbes valued the MLS teams in aggregate at $7.5 billion last year, and it valued that's 24 teams, and it valued the top 20 teams in Europe at $35 billion. And that's quite a striking difference. Now, it's not that you would expect the value of the European teams to be greater, given the greater revenues that they generate. But what's really striking about this is how the relationship between the value of the franchises and the teams to the dollars they generate in revenues, how strikingly different that is. So for every dollar of revenue that an MLS team generates, that is translated by Forbes into over $9 of business value. So that tells you that there's a very high relationship. It's a very high ratio. Whereas for the European teams, it's only each dollar of revenue translates into only $3.50 of value in terms of ownership. And that's a striking difference. And that's despite the fact that in terms of profits, the MLS teams in aggregate generated a loss, whereas the European soccer clubs in aggregate in this top 20 list generated $1.5 billion of profit. So that's striking. And just to take one example, the top of the list, Atlanta United, valued at $500 million, is on this method worth more than Everton, a team that is more than 140 years old, is worth less in today's value than a team that was founded just 6 years ago. So there's a very striking difference. And I'm not going to say that this is wrong. I'm just going to say that it needs an explanation. To such a striking difference in the valuation needs to be explained. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about how we would explain that in the European context. And here's something that probably most people know. This is a page taken from UEFA's club licensing reports, which are available online, are a very useful source of information on club finances in Europe. There are immense disparities. This lists the disparities between the average revenue of a club in the top division in each of the European national leagues. So there are 55 national leagues in Europe. That's the leagues covered by UEFA. And you have, at the one extent, you have England there at the top, where the average revenue in the Premier League is 272 million euros. And then at the bottom there, 55 SMR, you have the average revenue of 200,000 euros. So you have these immense differences. You have these elite leagues at the top, and a majority of leagues which generate relatively little by way of revenues. And that's also reflected at the level of the clubs. You also see the elite clubs generate an enormous amount of revenue, and there are a very small number of these elite clubs, and then you have very large numbers of lesser clubs that generate really quite small revenues by comparison. And that is reflected in another feature of European soccer, which is what I've termed dominance. And dominance is the phenomenon that the same teams win year in, year out. The same teams dominate the leagues year in, year out. And so, for example, take one example in Norway, in a 25-year period, one team managed to win the league 17 times. So, I mean, really almost no one gets to look in. And even though there were other winners, that's really a remarkable dominance. And this is true in not just in the smaller soccer nations like Norway, but in the big nations like England, Spain, France. Germany is not in this list, but that would also be true, where you see relatively small numbers of teams. And if we can compare that with the United States, at the bottom there you can see the 4 major leagues in the United States, where in each of those leagues, they come bottom of the list in terms of dominance. That in other words, the most wins by any team in over a 25-year period is 5, which is lower than any European league. And then you see the number of different teams that win over a period of 25 years. There are many, many more winners over time in the North American major leagues. And this both arises from the economics of soccer and major leagues in the United States, and is a consequence of that economics. So another thing to say about European leagues is that they are generally loss-making. And again, this table shows the losses over the last decade or so. And the green line is all of the leagues in Europe, but the red line excludes the English Premier League, which is by far the biggest revenue generator, and excludes Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, and Barcelona, the 3 really mega clubs in Europe outside of England. And once you exclude them, you can see that really there's a persistent loss making among European soccer clubs. That soccer clubs lose money from year to year. Their revenues are not as great as their costs. And that is reflected also in the financial precariousness of most clubs in most leagues. So this table is striking. It basically tells you the ratio of the assets to the liabilities of teams. You need, for a club to be solvent, for any business to be solvent, the assets have to exceed the liabilities. In other words, what you own must be worth more than what you owe to others. And if you're in negative territory, then you're essentially insolvent. Your business is no longer viable. Well, the leagues where the clubs are on average in negative territory are the ones shaded in red, and you can see the vast majority of leagues in Europe are in this negative territory. So this is a systemic problem in Europe of insolvency and living on the brink of financial collapse. And indeed, not just living on the brink, these losses and negative net assets frequently translate into insolvency itself. This is data from 3 countries, Germany, England, and France, looking across the 5 top divisions in those national systems. And you can see here the frequency of insolvency is very high. not at the top level. If you look at the top, if you look at the column labeled 1, that's the top tier in each country. And you can see, in fact, insolvency is almost unknown at the top tier. Even in the second tier, it's almost unknown in Germany. It's relatively infrequent. In France, it's a bit more frequent in England. But then when you get to the third level, you can see it's pretty common everywhere. And if we look at the aggregate numbers here, summing across the division, and unfortunately for these studies, we didn't have data for the fourth and fifth levels in France. Nonetheless, you can see that there's a really a common pattern of a high degree of insolvency, and these insolvencies occurring frequently amongst in the lower divisions of the competition. And I would going to say to you that this is very simple reason for this, and this is that it's the promotion and relegation system. And you heard some of the speakers this morning talk about approvingly about how the United States really, how will MLS make the next step forward? Well, it will be through the adoption of promotion and relegation, and that creates excitement, and it's all very, and it will generate interest in the leagues, and that might well be so. I'm certainly not saying that isn't true. But one thing I think we should recognize is the promotion relegation system creates a huge amount of financial uncertainty. And even though it's been universally adopted in soccer outside of the United States, or almost universally, even those leagues that don't have promotion relegation are committed to adopting it at some point in the future, except in the United States. And yet, this is really the source of the financial instability. And this picture shows you why that's true. This is based on data for English clubs, and it shows you what happens to the league position of teams in England in the seasons leading up to becoming insolvent. And on average, you drop 16 places in the league. I'm numbering these places from 1 being the best to 92, which is the bottom of the fourth tier in England, being the worst. And so as the numbers get higher, things get worse for you. And on average, in the 6 years leading up to insolvency, teams drop 16 places on average. 16 since there are 20 to 24 teams in each of the leagues in England, what that means is that you've almost certainly been relegated if you become insolvent. And insolvency creates huge problems because it's hard to, your revenues will drop because the teams you're playing are less attractive, and you need to cut your costs, but it's hard to cut costs quickly, particularly if you're trying to sell players. When you're trying to sell players quickly, people recognize distressed sales when they see them. So it's hard to get to generate the same revenue that you would in normal times. And in any case, you have to preserve some of your team, because if you get rid of all of your players, you're likely to get relegated yet again. And it's not that uncommon for teams to get relegated more than once within 2 or 3 seasons, and that is even more catastrophic for your finances. So that's why you have this financial instability in Europe. And essentially, this is if we think about the whole of the system, you can see that the two systems are the reason for the difference in the valuation of the Major League Soccer teams and the European football teams. Essentially, what you have in Europe is a system of more or less unrestricted economic competition, because you have all these leagues competing against each other. You have all the teams in the leagues competing against each other. You have all the teams competing to avoid relegation and to be promoted. And that means that teams are willing to spend anything in order to avoid the drop. It means that teams that are successful are really unwilling to engage in any of the sharing mechanisms that you see in the major leagues in the United States, because if I'm successful and I share with those who aren't successful, then I'm likely to risk becoming unsuccessful like them. And if I'm unsuccessful like them, it's not like being the Detroit Lions, where I can be a basement feeder forever. I will get relegated, and that will be financially catastrophic for my team. So teams are unwilling to share revenues in any serious way. And so you have these two systems, these two competing systems, and in some ways both of them are really successful economic systems. I mean, major league sports in the United States are really successful. NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, some of the most successful leagues in sports anywhere in the world, if not the most successful. But also you have soccer, the world's most popular sport, which is dominated by European teams and European competition, and notwithstanding all of this financial fragility that we see in Europe. And in some ways, it's important to think that what the issue in Europe is not that the system may be unstable for each individual club, but actually it's not really systemically that unstable. It's not systemically unstable because the teams always survive. And that's the last part of the puzzle. What happens when a team becomes insolvent? Somebody relaunches it again. So we've just had this just recently in England, a club called Macclesfield Town, and I'd be surprised if anybody had ever heard of them. They're a low-level team that've been around for 100 years or more, never been successful, never won anything, never been in the top division, but have a strong local following in their town. Where in the town of Macclesfield, they're very popular. They went bankrupt this year, and they're already being launched again. And because they represent the town, and they don't just represent, they're not just a business, they're not just somebody's way of making money, they represent the image of the town. And although the people who ran Macclesfield Town before it went bankrupt have now gone their way and presumably doing something else with their lives, a new group of people are coming in, presumably all local people in Macclesfield, and they're all coming in to make sure and relaunch the team and make it and rejoin the competitive system. And that's what happens in every single case in soccer. It's almost unknown for any team ever to disappear permanently. There are teams that close temporarily, but they're always revived. And that's why the system is stable, because although insolvency is bad for the people who own the club, if you own this asset, if you bought it and it goes bankrupt, you lose everything you put into it. So that's bad for you as an owner, but it's not bad for the team or for the fans of the club, because the club survives. That's the difference. Well, let's talk a bit about Major League Soccer then and how that fits into this system. Well, Major League Soccer is a fundamentally different business model from anything in Europe, but it's also slightly different from the main model in the United States. The Major League Soccer itself could describe itself as a single entity league, which means that, and the main point about this single entity is that players are not hired by their teams directly, they are contracted to the league, and the league pays their salaries. So that each individual team is not really an independent entity, it's essentially a franchise controlled by the center, and the operators are members of the MLS ownership team, and they each operate their own club, but they're not responsible for the majority of the wage payments that go to the players there, and ultimately they don't even technically control where the players are located. So in principle, the center MLS can relocate players within the system. MLS then also, as well as contracting with the players, they take a share of the revenues from each of the operators in order to pay the wages, and then they sell collectively the broadcast and sponsorship rights through a vehicle called SUM, Soccer United Marketing, which has also sought to expand its portfolio by marketing other soccer rights in North America. So most notably, they market the rights to the US national teams, the men's and the women's national teams, but they also market other rights, such as the games played by the Mexican national team when they play in the United States. And the Mexican national team now plays more games in the United States than it plays in Mexico itself. So that's the basic structure of the league, which is slightly different from the standard model in the US, but not that different actually. So if we talk about how COVID works, obviously this is a global health crisis, and I've listed the most affected nations by deaths per million of population. It seems to me deaths per million is probably the major metric that you want to think about how a pandemic is going to affect an economy. So there are obviously direct effects of COVID on sports in the terms of games cancelled, games without in-person attendance or with limited in-person attendance, and we've seen that throughout the current year. And you look at the list of those countries, and those countries are the US stands right in the middle of it, but also all the others are major soccer-playing nations as well. In that sense, it's affecting soccer globally, pretty much anywhere you are. The one exception, perhaps a little bit, is Germany, but even there, Germany seems to be catching up with the rest of the world in terms of the impact of COVID. Now, from a commercial perspective, this has indirect effects as well because of the effect of the global recession, which we are entering at the moment, have been entering for this year. And that reduces demand, and that's going to affect people's willingness to spend money on sports as on other forms of entertainment. However, I think we should view this only as a temporary economic shock. It's although it's this is a health-related economic crisis, it still is, in terms of its economic dimensions, it looks like most other major economic crises of like a recession. It has a particular impact on sports. Sport is perhaps more affected than they normally are in these because of the special nature of the impact. But in the longer term, we should expect, when the economy recovers, as it will, we should also expect that sports will recover. It's not really plausible to think that people have become significantly less interested in sports just because of COVID, and that once the economy returns to something like normal, then sports themselves will recover to something like normal. So in terms of, we think about the response and the way in which that's being affected, well, the difference is between Europe and the United States is quite significant, and this was clear right in Europe, was clear right from the start. I have a couple of quotes there coming from early on in the pandemic, where basically describing this as an existential threat to the game. Ernst & Young did a study in Sweden and said that 14 out of 15 clubs were basically bankrupt if as a result of COVID. And that's given that the clubs already lived on the edge of financial collapse. Most clubs were already on the edge of financial disaster. It's not surprising that a shock like COVID would actually push many of them over the edge. Actually, we still, as yet, have not seen that many clubs collapse, but most of them, if you read the press, you will see that generally speaking, it's thought that many of them are it's just a matter of time before many of them fall into insolvency. And that's where Project Big Picture came up, which you may have heard of the last few weeks ago, where Liverpool and Manchester United, both owned by American owners, came up with a bailout package for the smaller clubs, which was designed to prevent them from falling into bankruptcy, but with strings attached, which required the other clubs to make concessions and effectively cede dominance to clubs like Liverpool and Manchester United. And which, in the eyes of many, might ultimately lead to the abolition of promotion and relegation. And you can see how that would suit clubs like Manchester United and Liverpool, remove any risk that they would face from that, and maybe induce more of the revenue sharing kinds of activities that you see in North America, which in turn will enhance the economic value of the investments made by the owners of Manchester United and Liverpool. So the financial logic for the owners is clear for all to see. But one thing perhaps might puzzle an American audience is that this offer to bail out the weaker clubs and to prevent them from going to bankrupt was met with absolute an avalanche of anger and rejection, and no one wanted anything to do with this. So they would rather see the businesses go to the wall than take a handout from big clubs that then demand protection from competition. And if that seems perverse, go back to my point about Macclesfield Town. Macclesfield Town are not disappearing. They are going to be with us in the future. New owners, perhaps, but still, it'll be Macclesfield Town. And that's why people are prepared to reject these kinds of offers. Now, if we look at Major League Soccer, we see a very sort of different picture. Now, Major League Soccer, you might argue, would actually be more prone to the recession than the economic effects of COVID than European leagues, because the principal source of income for Major League Soccer teams has largely been gate money. They failed to generate significant revenues from TV deals, and therefore the loss of gate must have had a very severe economic impact. However, there are a few bright signs on the horizon, as were mentioned this morning on a number of occasions. The sale of new broadcast rights in 2022 is going to give them an opportunity to raise perhaps the revenue that they generate. And there's the World Cup coming in 2026. But perhaps the biggest point, though, is that the losses of Major League Soccer pale into insignificance when compared to the net worth of the owners. Major League Soccer is owned by a group of owners, and I totted up the total there. The combined net worth is over $140 billion. They can suffer the losses. And indeed, that's the difference with largely in Europe, the majority of clubs, the net worth of the owners is relatively small. And so it's hard often for clubs to underwrite losses, whereas in Major League Soccer, it's very significant. That said, I think going forward, there are a couple of challenges for Major League Soccer. One is that Major League Soccer is spending only about $12 million per club on wage spending. And in terms of a comparison with Europe, you can see here that puts Major League Soccer somewhere between Austria and Switzerland, which, if you want to think in terms of the status and quality of a league, that's not perhaps where Major League Soccer wants to be. The French league, which is still not considered one of the biggest league in, it's still, of the big leagues, it's the smallest, if you will, is spending 5 times as much per team, and the Premier League is spending 13 times as much. And what you spend on player wages largely affects the quality of the league. There is a fairly strong correlation between what you spend and what you get, largely because there's a functioning transfer market which translates spending into value. The second challenge, which is not connected to the first one, is that Major League Soccer struggles to gain a television audience even in the United States. And again, the guys from England who were talking about how great MLS it is that you can see it in 190 countries around the world. Well, that may be true, but when it comes to, it's not a question of whether you can see it, it's whether people tune in to watch it, and they're not really even tuning in the United States to watch it. And you can see here in this, I just picked one random period from the summer, 8th to the 27th of July. You get the same if you looked at any other time. And you can see basically here, of the top 25 games broadcast, only 2 MLS games appeared in that top 25. The others are taken up by Mexican Mexican league games or Mexican competition games or English Premier League games. And those 2 leagues really dominate in the US soccer broadcasting market. And on the right, you can see the top 100 games. And what I've listed there is, again, in green, I've highlighted the MLS games. And what you can see is that the MLS games, it's not that there aren't plenty of MLS games, it's that they're just not attracting the audiences. And the audiences they're attracting are relatively small, which of course is also a challenge when it comes to the renegotiation of the broadcast rights, because it's a real issue about whether they're going to be able to sell the rights for a significant sum when they're not attracting the audiences that the Liga MX and the Premier League can attract. So really, this is the challenge here is in the US is whether a US Major League Soccer, which is built on a US business model, can work in a global market. And there are kind of I put this sort of make 2 points really. One is that there are in terms of opportunities, there are good signs for MLS in many ways. So the first point to make is they have a very protected position within the US market. So they are, because there's no promotion relegation, the only way that they can be challenged, the teams in that can be challenged is by the establishment of a rival league. And the establishment of rival leagues in major league sports in the United States usually ends up badly for the entrant. There's a long history of this. And the MLS has enjoyed extremely favorable treatment by the federation, which in principle supports the opportunity of any league to compete at any level, but in fact, in reality, has largely favored Major League Soccer over the years. And so that protection is of significant value to MLS and its teams. The sheer wealth of its owners is also a significant protection for the league and a significant force. So if the owners wanted to put serious money into buying players, that could change the landscape dramatically. But they've never shown a willingness to do that. They've never shown an interest in that up until now. That may change, but at the moment, that's not what they're interested in doing. They will, again, it was suggested this morning that maybe they would adopt promotion relegation. I'm willing to bet that they will never do that because they see it, they want to make a profit out of this business, and they know full well that promotion relegation undermines profitability, and that's why they won't do it. But then finally, the big opportunity is, as I say, is the World Cup, and people have mentioned that. When the World Cup comes to town, that is a significant opportunity for any national league, and it will have a positive impact on MLS, as it will on all soccer in the United States. So the question marks remain, however. So MLS, to be successful, needs to break through into the TV media markets. They cannot really continue to grow as an attendance-only, live gate-only league. They will need somehow to break into the media markets and generate revenues from that. And again, it's hard to see how you can do that without better quality players. Again, there was some talk about the rising quality of the players, and the Commissioner Garber has talked in recent times of the MLS needing to be a selling league. But the fact of the matter remains is that a lot of the players that are going to Europe are completely from the United States, which is starting to produce some high quality talent in the men's market at last. Of course, I haven't said very much about the women's market at all today, but I mean, obviously, US has dominated women's soccer for a long time now and produced the best talent. The beginnings of development of talent in the men's market, though, seems to be bypassing MLS. These players don't seem to be coming up to MLS and then being sold onto Europe. They're going straight into the youth training, the academy system in Europe. So that requires some change in the way that the leagues operate, and would require them to take significant losses. Some owners might be willing to do that. It seems there's been various comments in the media about some conflicts between owners and some of the more recent entrants into the league wanting to break loose. For example, you can imagine New York City FC, owned by Sheikh Mansour from Abu Dhabi, who has a net worth that is over $100 billion. He wouldn't mind throwing a few $100 million into player salaries. and wouldn't hurt him. But the opposition comes from the many of the owners who've been there from the beginning, who are in this for the long haul and do not wish to spend those money. So for MLS, I think there are opportunities, but there are significant obstacles in form of the way that the league is organized. And what will be interesting to see is to whether, well, really two things, whether MLS will overcome these issues in the future, but also which really of these two economic models, the European economic model of soccer or the North American model of sports, which one will end up dominating the sport of soccer. Okay, I'll leave it at that. There are some questions that I can see in the Q&A box. I can answer those straight away, or Abby or Jacob, do you want to take it back, and how do you want to do this?
You can go ahead and answer those.
Okay, so about MLS being somewhere between Austria and Switzerland, has there been a historically increasing trend in MLS wages, and is this trend increasing fast enough to get us higher up that list soon? That's a great question, and the answer is it is increasing, and it is increasing at a rate that is somewhat faster than Europe. But when I say somewhat faster, the average rate of wage growth in the per team in Major League Soccer has been in the region of I think 9 or 10%, and the average rate of wage growth in Europe is about 7 or 8%. So that 2 to 3 percentage point difference would take, at that rate, it would take decades for MLS to catch up. So it's still going to take time. And when you say what steps can clubs and leagues take to incentivize higher wages when it goes against the business of the clubs? Well, I think you put your finger on it. You can't. The league MLS is controlled by the teams. The teams voting for more competition means voting for less profit. That's what has to happen. They have to decide that they want to lose money. That's perhaps not that likely. The next question, do you believe in its current state financial fair play operates successfully, and will this pandemic point to certain areas for new legislation or adapting the current laws? Well, no, I've actually been an opponent and a critic of financial fair play since its inception, in fact, since before it began. So I think financial fair play has actually been pretty, it hasn't really, it turns out I think it hasn't had much of an impact at all, but to the extent it's had an impact, it's had a negative one, and partly because it really is, it operates in a way that protects the big clubs from competition, which is the last thing we want. We want the big clubs to face more competition, not less competition. But that's a much longer argument. So I'd refer you to some of my other research if you're interested in finding out more about that. The next question: does the wage structure in MLS inhibit the league's ability to pay, and therefore attract bigger players? Yes, it does. MLS inhibits the league's ability to pay because the people who decide the league's ability to pay are the owners, and the owners would have to pay out of their own pockets, and they don't want to do that. It's you know, the money has the investment funds. If you want to have players of the standards of the big leagues in Europe, you have to put up the money first. If you do that, you will have a higher quality league, and then people will start to watch it more on TV, and you will generate more revenues. But like any business, you have to spend first in order to get the money back. The problem with Major League Soccer is they don't really want to do the spending first. They don't want to commit themselves to that. They're hoping that Major League Soccer will somehow become this incredibly attractive league without ever paying for the players that would make it so. And that's really the challenge that they face. The next question: in order for WSL to grow, would it be more beneficial to create more teams in large markets with lots of competition for attention, such as New York, like MLS has? or small markets. That's again a great question about NWSL. I think NWSL is working to a slightly different business model, and I think again, I think NWSL would benefit from promotion and relegation. I think it's one way to think about it is the leagues in Europe grew up. They didn't require large investors to come in and put up large sums of money. They grew organically by people in local markets starting their own teams, and then through the system of promotion and relegation, becoming more and more successful and gaining more and more popularity. That could actually work in the US, I think. That system could work. And NWSL would be a great place to try that out. Because, and one thing we notice is that the rich investors are not willing to put the same kinds of money behind NWSL that they are behind the men's game, because they don't think people want to watch the men's game because that's what people haven't watched in the past. The opportunity, I think, to create a women's game that would be more grassroots based would actually be better, and would actually potentially attract a lot of interest. Do I think a European Super League will happen? Well, I wrote an article in 1999 talking about how a European Super League might happen. So I'm more or less given up on this discussion. The answer is maybe. We've actually been talking about a European Super League since the early 1980s. So it's about 35 years it's been under discussion. Could happen, but there's a lot of resistance, partly because people love the promotion relegation system. And that's not just fans like it, it's that politicians are prepared to pass laws to preserve it, I think. What's my thought on a joint Mexican-US league? Okay, that's a really great question. I think the issue with that is going to be which clubs would you put into that? You need a lot of Mexican clubs to generate the Mexican fans and support, because people of Hispanic Mexican origin want to watch Mexican teams. So where does that, how many clubs can you have in this league? Does it become a promotion and relegation league system? Would you share the revenues? That might become much more profitable, but then you'd have to share the profitability with the Mexican team. So I think there's a lot of potential in that, but there's a lot of potential opposition in the form of the business logic not being quite right for people who are trying to make money out of this. Where do I see the future finance of lower division soccer in the US going? Well, I'm a big fan of Detroit City FC, a local grassroots team. They play. They're building up. Again, they tried to specifically to adopt a European model where they build around grassroots and they grow up. They're looking to find the best competition they can. But whatever the competition is, Detroit City FC is going to survive because the fans love Detroit City FC one way or the other. And that might be the way in which grassroots soccer can, lower division soccer can grow in the United States, by building on these local community organizations rather than these traditional big business models that we see in the major leagues. Also interested in how MLS has increased the quality of CONCACAF nations, Panama, but has not necessarily increased quality of USA players with the best players. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, MLS, the right name for MLS is minor league soccer, and that's a bit mean, but I mean, it's really true that it's a perfectly good league, and it plays. There's some very entertaining soccer in MLS. And I have nothing against it, and I think it has every potential to grow into a genuinely major league at some point. However, the way they're organizing themselves, they are committing themselves to being minor league, and that has big benefits to bringing that level of organization and structure to North America, because North America didn't have much by the way of organized leagues since the collapse of NASL in the mid-1980s, the original NASL. To move, so in that sense, I mean, the growth of soccer has been a benefit to the United States, and MLS has been part of that growth of soccer. No, there's no question about that. And other leagues benefit from growing professionalization of the game. Other countries benefit, but the US is not benefiting in proportion to its size. I mean, America is a big global player and expects to be among the best in everything. It is the best in women's soccer by far. It expects to be the best in men's soccer. MLS is not a vehicle that is really delivering or is likely to deliver that kind of level of play, even if it might come through other grassroots growth. Am I saying that the MLS is at risk to a new league owned by owners willing to pay real money for top US talent and willing to pay to attract top foreign talent? Yeah, I would completely be at risk from that. If you could find somebody who would pay that kind of money, yeah, that could work. Where there is such a group of investors is a different question. And then Avi, I see you've got your joining. There are a few more questions, but I think you want to move on to your next session, so we probably have to draw a close.
Yeah, maybe just one more question for the audience.
Okay. Well, there are a few, but let me see. So a very good question there from Adam. Will we start to see more corporate groups like City Football that own multiple clubs in different markets? And do I think that model is a good idea? Very good question. Frankly, this has been something that's been going on for some time. But to the extent that it becomes to look like a farm system, that will really undermine the promotion and relegation system. And so, like most people of European origin, I have an emotional commitment to promotion and relegation system. But as an economist, I also think it's in the best interest of the fans as well. I believe it actually works in the interest of fans. So to the extent that a farm system would undermine promotion and relegation, I think that's a bad thing to happen. But I can see why it's in the interests of the big clubs to try to create a farm system. Again, that comes back to what's in the best interest of the big clubs and what's in the best interest of soccer as a whole.
Thank you so much, Dr. Szymanski. This is a great talk, and I think our audience will have found it very illuminating. And yeah, so thank you for taking the time today, and I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.